Our last speaker is Douglas Murray. He's a writer and a journalist and a speaker in many debates. He's an experienced speaker, and I won't introduce anything more than that. So please welcome Mr. Douglas Murray.
Thank you. Welcome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jan. Thank you to all the organisers of today's event. I was just saying to Hamid, it's a bit difficult because I've been listening to the previous speeches and there's not very much left to say. So unless I start making stuff up, I think what I suggest is I'll speak for about 20, 30 minutes and then have as much time as possible for questions or argument or whatever it is you'd most like. This is, I'm starting to feel this might be almost like a Scandinavian tour I'm in the middle of. Not quite as high profile as Justin Bieber, who I see is in town, but it's also very protracted. It's about a year ago, I think, I was last in the vicinity, speaking at the Danish Parliament in Copenhagen for the 10th anniversary of the publication of the cartoons. An event that was remarkable for a lot of reasons, one of which was that that morning Jyllands-Posten republished a facsimile of the double-page spread on which the cartoons had originally appeared, and everything was the same except that the cartoons weren't there. And a headline said something along the lines of, "The intimidation works." You know, they had hoped to publish them, but they'd taken a view on it and decided in the end it just wasn't worth it. In any case, Henrik Broder from Germany, Mr. Selbech, whose first name I will not even attempt to pronounce, from Norway, the newspaper editor who first republished the cartoons there, and Mark Stein and I were speaking about the significance of that event, and a very jolly occasion it was. Slightly marred at the moment during the event when Mark Stein said, "I've just had a message from my assistant saying that the Her Majesty's Foreign Office in London has given a travel warning advisory about our conference, saying that British subjects should not go to the centre of Stockholm today, or should at least be very wary of it." And the US State Department also sent out a message saying that American citizens should keep away from the vicinity of the Parliament in Copenhagen. And as Mark Stein pointed out, they hadn't bothered to tell either him or me about this, but then it wasn't going to make any difference anyway. But he did also point out that 10 years ago you had to go to Helmand to be in that much danger, and now you can just fly to Copenhagen. Almost everything that needs to be said about free speech has already been said, but it's always worth going over some of the fundamentals. For myself, one of my favorite quotes about free speech was, and I'll give you two of them over the course of this next few minutes, but it's from the American writer H.L. Mencken, who I'm sure some at least of you have read. One of my favorite quotes from him, he once said, "The human mind has been furthered best by gay fellows who heaved dead cats into sanctuaries and went roistering down the highways of the world, proving to all men that doubt, after all, was safe." I sometimes thought of putting together a group called the Gay Fellows. But Mencken meant it very much in the old-fashioned sense, and I didn't want to walk into confusion. But that is true. Free speech is best furthered by happy people, shall we say, roistering down the highways of the world, having heaved dead cats into sanctuaries and shown that it was all fine and that doubt was worth it. One of the oddities, I would say, of the last more than a decade now has been the way in which in countries like this, in countries like mine, I'm from Britain, if you hadn't guessed, one of the strange things about it is that throughout this whole period, there seems to have been some kind of agreement that we would end up talking a lot about free speech. Endless books have been published over the last decade about free speech. What is free speech? Whither free speech? And so on. Just recently I reviewed another book by Timothy Garton-Ash of Oxford University, Free Speech, 10 Rules for an Interconnected World, that sort of thing. I've come to the conclusion, having read far too many of these sort of books, that there's not much point in them. We don't need more and more books about free speech. Free speech isn't something you just endlessly talk about. It's meant to be something you do. We don't need more books saying something about the origins of free speech. We just need more books that do free speech. Endlessly talking about free speech for writers is like asking a dancer to keep talking about dance, or an artist to keep talking about art or how they do it. It's not the point. The point is to keep getting on and doing it. And that's what it seems to me has been most lacking in recent years. We've had this little get-out bit that we can keep talking about the free speech, but whilst that becomes a bigger and bigger industry, we have fewer and fewer cartoonists, we have fewer and fewer novelists willing to write about this area, and we have fewer and fewer poets even wishing to write about it, or do we? It was my great pleasure in my self-appointed role as a cat heaver earlier this year to try to challenge that. Some of you will have followed the case of the German comedian Jan Böhmermann, another name I'm almost certain to have just mispronounced. But he, you'll remember, has a late-night comedy show on German television. He discovered that another German station had worried about saying something rude about Mr. Erdogan, the president of Turkey. So to prove that it was possible to still be rude about Mr. Erdogan in Germany, this comedian recited a late-night television poem about Mr. Erdogan. And unfortunately, as often with these things, the attempt to prove you could do something ended up proving you couldn't. Mr. Böhmermann was not only the subject of diplomatic complaints from Turkey to Germany, but then an attempted prosecution in Germany, which I'm sure many of you have read about, followed, and been equally irritated about. For my own part, I thought once again this is one of those occasions we could recite the issue of free speech in Germany. We could try to remind Chancellor Merkel about the tradition of Mill and Milton and more, or we could just get on and do it. So I inaugurated the first offensive type Recep Erdogan poetry competition, where everybody had to write a poem about Mr. Erdogan. I led the way with a poem which I was surprised my editor published, but the point of it was that you had to be extremely offensive about him. It wasn't allowed just to be rude or snarky or something. It had to be gratuitous. No non-gratuitous poems would make it. It had to be defamatory as well. Non-defamatory poems, I decided, couldn't do anything with them. Anyhow, I did my opening number and invited my readers to send in their poems, also being as rude as possible and defamatory and vile about Mr. Erdogan. And very swiftly, a reader, a kindly reader, offered £1,000 cash prize. So my readers started to send in poems in even larger numbers. I liked to think that they were propelled by a deep belief in free speech, but it's possible they just wanted the cash. Anyhow, the number of poems increased. We got some very fine entries. And at one point, my editor called up and said, well, the former mayor of London, Boris Johnson, has entered the competition. I thought, well, this, I must say, by the way, I owe him a slight apology. He was in an interview with a friend who writes for a Swiss paper who said, have you heard what Douglas is doing at The Spectator? And Boris said, yeah, absolutely, what terrific stuff, and so on. And this friend said, well, why don't we make up a limerick right here and now? And Boris said, yes, why don't we? Being that sort of chap. And anyhow, rather unfairly, as I say, he, not knowing he'd entered, but it was on record, entered. And I thought it would be best if we agreed that he had won. He took the news, I have to say, quite well. He offered to give the money to charity. And he was in the middle of the Brexit campaign at that point, and it was rather difficult for him because the other side in the Brexit campaign, the Remain side, were largely at that point campaigning on the idea that Boris Johnson was this sort of idiot who just sort of said things left, right and centre that he ended up having to apologise for. So I didn't help with that bit of the narrative. But anyway, he took it very well. There was great silence from his political opponents, actually, who realised they were about to fall into a trap of saying you mustn't be rude about the Turkish Sultan. Anyhow, Boris Johnson, of course, subsequently, after Brexit, was made our Foreign Secretary. So I did tell readers that, in actual fact, I just pretended that the prize was £1,000. It was actually the position of Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. Anyhow, Boris, of course, went to see President Erdogan the other day and shook his naughty hand, and that was a great pleasure. Anyhow, it was principally a pleasure, of course, to rub it in the face of Chancellor Merkel. Because what could be more ridiculous than prosecuting a comic in Germany for a poem, only doing that whilst your nearby ally has a foreign secretary willing to do the same thing. Now, in Britain, we don't send our foreign secretary to prison for insulting Mr. Erdogan. We make him foreign secretary. But I think it would be unsustainable that Jan Böhmermann can actually be prosecuted or go to prison for a maximum, I think it was, of 4 years in Germany for that alleged crime. Anyway, this is my view generally on free speech. The answer is not to have endless seminars about it, it's just to do it and encourage everyone else to do it and do it more and more and break all the rules and laws if they're there, because who do we want to tell us what we can say or think or do? Who would you appoint to be such a person? As I pointed out, the person I would rely on last to tell me what kind of joke I would be allowed to tell would be a German judge. A point on which I hope you'll agree. So anyway, it's also strange regarding this issue of free speech these days, because I have increasingly come to the view that not very many people actually believe in it. In January of 2015, when the Charlie Hebdo attacks occurred, I was in a studio just afterwards, and I bumped into a tabloid journalist from the UK, from one of the UK's main newspapers, The Sun, and said, what are you going to do about this? What's the plan? And he said something which was one of the only wise things I heard during that awful period. He said, I'm not sure people in this country are that fond of free speech. And we had a short discussion about this, but I was sort of persuaded of this in a way. Just before the blasphemy police walked into that office in Paris, the main discussion in Britain had been over whether a female columnist at The Sun, a sort of vulgar and idiotic loudmouth to my view, called Katie Hopkins, should have been sacked for a particular column she'd written, and indeed prosecuted. Now, I didn't particularly like her columns. In fact, I don't like them at all, but that's my choice. I can read them or not read them. I can put the paper down or not. But only in this ridiculous age does somebody, often who's not even bothered to buy the paper and read the column, decide that they must phone the police because of that column, or call for that person to be sacked because of that column. And that's simply the prevailing mood of our time, and nowhere so much as among young people. It's a very strange thing that increasingly free speech, which should be something that the young understand the necessity of intrinsically, is something that the young in particular have decided to abandon. Or to put it another way, as university campuses across the Western world now show, they say they believe in free speech, but really they believe in free speech for themselves, but not for anyone who disagrees with them. It's free speech for me, but not for thee. I can say anything I like about anyone else, but if they say anything that I disagree with, I'll call the police or retreat into a safe space or moan about intersectionality. I don't know if intersectionality has come to Sweden. Yes. Yeah. You know the drill. You know the drill. If anyone doesn't, it's the idea that basically there is a white male patriarch hegemony which has all the power, and in a similar manner persecutes all other groups, all of which therefore have to align against this thing. One of the, of course, wonderful things about it is that they don't realize that the alleged patriarchal majority is, by any calculation, an incredible minority. And the people who claim to be the minorities, actually, when you add them all together, are the distinct majority. Anyhow, they haven't done the math, as they say, but this idea that effectively, if you don't like something, you can shut it down, shut it up, exists everywhere. And by the way, the strange thing about this is not particularly that young people are doing this, so much as the fact that the adults keep on giving in. You'll probably have seen the video from Yale University last year where a group of students surrounded one of their professors and were yelling and effing and blinding at him because, in the words of one of the students, this, by the way, happened because they were unhappy about a Halloween party. Halloween, apparently, at Yale University is the most potentially traumatic event of the year. People could dress as something that could upset you. My view on this, by the way, is that if you can't cope with Halloween, you've got no right to be at Yale University. Because if you're going to be traumatized by a costume, you've got no hope in hell with Heidegger or quantum physics. These are the people who say that they want to leave their seminars in law classes if rape is mentioned, who will go on to discover, if they are unfortunate enough to become a lawyer in later life, that they're no damn use as a lawyer, because if they were representing a client who'd been raped, they'd have to leave the courtroom with their hands over their ears. Anyhow, these students were standing around their professor and they kept saying to him, "You don't understand." And in the words of one of them, she said, "You don't get it. We're trying to make a home here. This is a home." The remarkable thing about this was that nobody, not even the professor, turned round and said, "No, it's not. This is a university. It's very different from a home. If you want a home, you can go back to your mummy and daddy. You can go back and hide under a duvet, but this is a university. It's the best chance you're going to have in your life of getting new ideas, getting access to new information, being challenged, and instead of actually using that period to do all of these great and noble things, you've decided to cause it yourself and shut your eyes and ears." Now, it seems amazing to me, as I say, that so many times across the Western world at the moment, it's the adults who don't say to the kids on this, "You're wildly wrong, you're way out of line on this, and you don't know what you're doing." And they don't. They give in. The thing I would like to say on those occasions to students like that, and do on the occasional times now I do speak on campuses, which I don't do very often now, partly because there's not much point in agreeing to go somewhere where you'll probably be no platformed anyway, and it's not much of a thrill to do it. But when I do, I always say the same thing, just try to reiterate to students that free speech isn't something which is just one of a set of things you can pick and choose from. It is the absolutely central right upon which every other right is based. And that awareness of that, it strikes me, is disappearing all the time. Its absolute centrality, I would say, is being demonstrated day in and day out at the moment. And let me give you an example of that. The migration crisis through which Europe is going at the moment has been made infinitely worse at absolutely every step of the way by our inability to understand the importance of free speech. Absolutely every step of that journey. It's my belief that when the speech goes wrong, the ideas go wrong, and when the ideas go wrong, the politics goes wrong. And our politics has gone so very wrong in recent years because the speech has gone wrong, because the ideas have gone wrong. Let me give you a couple of examples. In September last year, at the height of the crisis that she herself had created, Chancellor Merkel sat at a lunch at the UN in New York and was sitting next to Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And Chancellor Merkel, unfortunately, as can happen to anybody, had an open mic. Her mic was still on, or there was a mic on the table that was on, and it picked up about 30 seconds of the conversation between her and Mark Zuckerberg, which they had thought was private. And in it, Chancellor Merkel opens by saying to Mark Zuckerberg, what can you do to stop people writing anti-migration stuff on Facebook? And his reply was, we're working on it. Now, absolutely everything, in my view, that has gone wrong in Europe in recent years can be traced back to that exchange. It epitomizes the problem. Chancellor Merkel, by the way, doesn't just try to stop criticism of herself. She tried to stop through Facebook the dissemination of almost any view of the migration crisis that was not entirely supportive of her point of view. And when I say that when the speech goes wrong, the politics goes wrong, here are just a few examples of how that happens. George Orwell said, it's one of the quotes that was on the handout for this conference, famously said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. So let me divide this into two different sections. Firstly, what Chancellor Merkel and other politicians across our continent, and particularly I would say the Swedish government, did not want people to hear. They did not want to hear that letting in millions of people into Europe in the space of months would massively destabilize European society for our long-term future. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted to believe that societies, cultures like ours, are such enormously powerful things that you could allow in millions of people from totally different cultures and that they would get with the program on the second or so day they arrived. I don't see cultures like that, by the way. I see them more as kind of fragile ecosystems, which take years and years to grow up, decades and centuries to develop, and which can be destroyed in the space of a lifetime. Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues took a different view. But by shutting down the debate, at no point did they allow themselves access to the questions that they should have been asking. And the remarkable thing about this is that only 5 years before she made that catastrophic, to my mind, decision, Chancellor Merkel gave one of her most famous speeches in which she said that multiculturalism had failed. What did she mean by that? She said it herself. She said, at the beginning of the speech, she said, we had assumed that the guest workers would go home. To my mind, this is a demonstration of every single thing in the post-war migration period in Europe having been woefully misunderstood. At no stage did any of our politicians ever anticipate the things that would happen next. At no stage. People thought that the people who came in would leave. People thought they wouldn't come in such large numbers. People thought they would come in such large numbers, but then they would integrate. People then thought maybe they shouldn't integrate. Some people said you should integrate, and their colleagues said no, that's colonialist thinking, and so on. So we were confused throughout this whole episode, and we were partly confused because we deliberately stopped ourselves from having the discussion. That we will end up having to have at some point anyway. Let me give you one quick example. It's been obvious to me for a long time that if you say that if you open the borders, as Chancellor Merkel did last year, you have an absolute horde of questions that follow on next. It would seem to me that the most obvious question to ask is Europe a place in which anyone in the world who wants a better life can legitimately come and live? That's the beginning of a question to ask. The current thinking, it seems, is to stem the flow at the time being, but we still haven't addressed any of the fundamental questions. I was asking a German politician about this the other day in Berlin, where I was with Daniel Pipes and his group. If you go, as I have done, to all the points of entry in the Greek islands and Italian islands, you see an undoubted tide of human misery. There is no way of glossing this. It is people from across sub-Saharan Africa, across North Africa, across the Middle East, the Far East, coming to Europe for all sorts of reasons. They want a better life. Many of them are fleeing war. Many of them are fleeing political persecution. They are terrible, terrible stories. But none of the answers that Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues have given could possibly answer this question. What, for instance, do you say to an Afghan refugee like one I was speaking to the other day on the island of Lesbos, who said, why have the Germans given preferential asylum treatment to the Syrians? The Syrians have only had a civil war for 5 years. We've had one for 15. Why don't you make sure you have as generous provision for all the people from Afghanistan who'd like to come to Germany and Europe as you do for everybody else? Eritrea, which almost nobody in Europe had heard of until the last year, is a terrible society. It's undoubtedly a society in which very, very many millions of people, if they had the chance, would want to leave and come to Europe. The current discussion about this has reduced to the discussion of legitimate asylum seekers and economic migrants. Let's say that the Vice Commissioner of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, was right earlier this year when he said in his estimate at least 60% of the people who arrived into Europe in 2015 had no more right to be in Europe than anybody else in the world. Let's say that's right. Let's say that there are going to be consequences from that. Let's say that Germany is therefore going to deport 750,000 people who arrived last year. Let's say that Sweden is going to, as one of your government ministers pretended, deport 80,000 of the people who arrived last year. None of this is going to happen. It's an absolute lie, and they must know it as they say it. They must know it. There is no way on earth that they have the provision or the political will to carry out such an act. So they continue to fib themselves, and the press and others continue to go along with not asking the questions they want. So here is one which gets us towards, as it were, the point of conclusion faster. Let's pretend that Chancellor Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker, who we in Britain thankfully no longer have to see very much of, let's say that they invented in the coming weeks a machine, a sort of body scanner-like machine that you get at airports, which when you walked through it at the southern points of entry into Europe, determined at a bleep whether you're a legitimate asylum seeker or an economic migrant. And let's say that there was the political will to, in fact, repatriate the 6 out of 10 or so who were economic migrants rather than legitimate asylum seekers. Does Europe still want to insist on welcoming everybody in the world who is a legitimate asylum seeker? Now, my view is that, laudable as that is, it's impossible. Recently, on one of the Greek islands, I was speaking to some young men from Bangladesh. They are opponents of the regime there. They are enemies of the government, and they have a completely legitimate asylum claim in Europe. But if you add up all of these countries, from Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq and Syria, and across the Middle East, and you go all across North Africa and down into sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who have absolutely legitimate asylum claims to come to Europe. And this is a discussion which I very rarely hear. I very rarely hear any politician willing to get into the long grass on this and talk about it realistically. And here is then the second problem of that. If the politicians don't allow the speech, then you get bad speech. Then the speech goes wrong. Let me give you a couple of examples. In recent months, I've noticed an upsurge on social media and across some protest groups in Europe of talking about refugees in the most appalling terms. You can see protest movements that describe all migrants to Europe as, for instance, rape-fugees, or some that will call them, for instance, refugee-jihadists, an unamusing term, a dumb term as well as being an offensive one. But that's what you end up getting. Chancellor Merkel pretends that all of the people coming are legitimate, all of the people are good, none of them will ever do anything bad, Europe is their new home. And then the response, sure as anything, is that you get people who say that all of these people, including many people who fled from rape and jihad, are themselves rapists and jihadists. It's the same thing you can see being played out in the States. You get a president who is so unwilling to say the word Islam or Islamist or Islamism or Islamic terrorism and so on, that he, even when an American hostage is decapitated by a guy shouting Allahu Akbar in the Syrian desert, says that that attack probably had less to do with Islam than with any other religion. It's inevitable when you have a US president who says that somewhere down the road you're going to get a counterpart who says, for instance, not one Muslim should come into the States. It's yin and yang, as obvious as night follows day, that's what happens. Because the generation of politicians who've been in charge tried to stop the debate, tried to stop the discussion, and so the discussion is turning rancid across Europe. This seems to me to be the clearest possible threat to our societies in Europe, and one which we are unbelievably loath to admit to. You know, Mencken, I said I'd give you another quote. H.L. Mencken once also said, "The most dangerous man to any government is the man who's able to think things out for himself and without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos." But we have so many prevailing superstitions and taboos in our societies, and our politicians found them so incredibly helpful for years, that I genuinely see for the first time, I think, in my adult life, how bad this could go in Europe. For the last week, we've gone to Paris, to Berlin, and now to Stockholm. When somebody said to me the other day in Stockholm that they thought that Sweden was the craziest country in the world, apart perhaps from North Korea, I can assure you that having been to North Korea, you're on a very level pegging. There are so many things that one can see going wrong because, as I say, the speech has gone wrong, because the ideas have gone wrong, and we never thought them out. We never had the courage to go through with them, and people tried to shut us up and silence us. Well, if there's any point to a day like today, it is to say no to that, to say we will insist, we will disagree among ourselves, we will disagree with each other, and there will be much debate and discussion in the years ahead and things on which we will all disagree. But that on one thing in particular we have to be firm, which is that there should be nobody, no German judge, no German chancellor, no Swedish politician, no Brussels bureaucrat or British politician who should stop us from saying what we think about our own future. And that we have that right, we will retain that right, and we'll retain it whatever happens in the years ahead. Thank you. Now, I said we'd leave as much time as possible for questions. I hope we have. So, does that mean that Jan's going to ask the first one, or you just...
No, Mr. Bertil Malmberg. I know everyone here.
Douglas, in Sweden we hear a lot about these people from the press, the so-called academics. When they talk about free speech, they very, very often mix in the word "but."
Oh, yes.
What do you think about these people?
The Butt Brigade. Yeah. Yes. I do love that. But whenever anyone does it, I have a rule that I only start listening after the but. Everything they've said before the but's useless. Generally, it's some form of free speech. I believe in free speech for me, but not for thee. That's really what it is. I am good, you are bad. I am well-intentioned, you are bad-intentioned. So why would you allow somebody who had such terrible views you disagreed with to speak? That's all those people are doing. It's all they're doing on campus. It's all they're doing in the press.
Yes.
So I have two questions, and they're very different.
Could you put your microphone closer?
I have two questions, and they're very different. The first one is very dry. You either know or you don't. Am I not talking?
You need to bring it just slightly closer to your mouth.
And preferably
Right.
just one question at a time.
Okay. When the Geneva Convention came into being, it was about people who'd become refugees before the 1st of January 1950. Then it was extended, and in 1967, the New York Protocol was taken at the UN. Do you know anything about those circumstances, or could you point me to a book or someone who would know?
The quick answer to that is no, but there might well be somebody present who does. I don't know if...
Lots of books about that. I mean, everyone who's been into asylum law knows these things.
Really?
Yeah.
I really asked. The second question is that one question you often get when you say this bizarre migration policy that Sweden is pursuing, and to a certain extent other countries, is unsustainable, immoral, anti-democratic, illogical, and so on, but if you were a poor African, wouldn't you want to migrate to Europe? And the answer to that is, of course, yes.
Yes.
So how can you then deny someone else to do that? And I usually answer that it's not my decision. Give the people the right to decide, put all the cards on the table, what it costs, the amount of crime, and so on. However, that's a fairly dry answer. That's my type of answer. Do you have another answer?
There are all sorts of answers. Everything in the migration business, as I say, is damaged by not really having the discussion out. This is a discussion we should have had decades ago. The nature of what an asylum seeker is a discussion we should have had decades ago. The discussion of, for instance, how long somebody can remain an asylum seeker if, for instance, the situation in their country of origin has changed, is a discussion we should have had a long time ago. If you go to Rome, to the marketplace there are Egyptian gangs, among others, who run a lot of the marketplace there. They include people working in the black market who are Egyptian migrants who fled from previous Egyptian governments, some of whom, not all of whom, but some of whom want to return home. Okay? What is the Italian government doing about that? Nothing. There's no policy for this. There's no more policy than there is in Sweden to send back all the people who shouldn't have come last year. There's no policy for it. It's not going to happen. There is no political will for it. But these are discussions, as I say, we should have had decades ago. If, as everyone agreed, multiculturalism wasn't working in 2010 when immigration was at a comparative low point, why should it work when immigration is at an absolute historic high? It makes no sense. And as for this, as it were, the moral question underneath this, I think there is a profound question here which I'm not going to be able to answer, but I can give a couple of pointers on. It's the same question as the one which is, in my view, haunting Europe, which is the question of the Jews. The question of the Jews in the Second World War. You see this all around the migration crisis. There was a very haunting example the other day in La Stampa, one of the Italian papers, talking about the route now that the Austrian-Italian border and the French-Italian borders are very, very closed. There is an increasing flow of people walking through the mountain passes in over to Switzerland from North Italy. La Stampa had it was just an average day's news, but had a quote from a local who mentioned that this was a route which, in the winter it's very dangerous, but in the summer it's passable. And just this local just mentions that's the route the Jews used in the war. Everything is infused in our very old and very guilt-ridden continent. Everything is infused with these echoes, and we worry about it, and we're right to worry about it. We're right to worry about whether or not these migrants are the same as the migrants in the Second World War. But there are all sorts of other parts of that discussion we need to have. For instance, how many of the Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, for instance, arrived in a safe country and then said, I don't find the system here so useful, I'll walk to another. Yeah. How many of those fleeing persecution before and during the Second World War were picky about it? I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but I mean, this is a different type of movement. But the follow-on from that is this odd thing, which I say I don't have an answer to, but I can just put an idea in your head about it, which is this odd thing that, as I say, Europe is a place in which anyone in the world can come and live. I think we need to think about this and discuss this very widely and very profoundly, because otherwise, as I say, this is going to lead to all sorts of problems in the years ahead. It seems to me absolutely legitimate that the peoples of Europe should be able to have a place they call home, and that place should not be taken away from them, because after all, we don't have another choice. There's that extraordinarily haunting bit in Michel Houellebecq's Submission, which many of you will know, when talking with his Jewish girlfriend, the main character discovers she's going to go to Israel because things have got so bad in France and she's Jewish, and he says, I don't have an Israel. That is one of the most important thoughts in Europe. Now, we don't have an opt-out. We don't have a get-out. We don't have a place to run to. We don't have another deal on the side here. This is our home. And so we should think very, very deeply before giving that home up to the entire world. Because among other things, that deal will not be reciprocal. When Europeans go to another country by the millions, it's colonialism. Colonialism, thank goodness, has ended. But we haven't even begun to think of the consequences of the movement of millions of people into our home for what we agree is in perpetuity. I do not believe that it is the right of everybody in the world who wants to be in Europe to be in Europe. And it cannot be. We have, as I say, a fragile ecosystem of a society, like every society, and we cannot give it over to the entire world. And if that makes us have some pangs of guilt, then that's good. We should have pangs of guilt over that. We're human beings. We're moral beings. But it should not be the case that our pangs of guilt make us destroy our societies. It's my view as a small c conservative that Edmund Burke was right in that central point of his philosophy, that a culture, a society is not simply about us here now, that it is a deal between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born, and that you cannot break that pact, and that what you have inherited you do not have the right to give away, any more than you have the right to destroy future generations of your own family or future generations yet unborn. It is a very central pact to civilization, that deal between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. It is a central pact of civilization. And if you give it up, if you say that the yet to be born, it doesn't matter if their society represents Mogadishu more than it does downtown Stockholm, then you are breaking that pact, which may not be yours to break.
I have a horrible question to you.
Fire away.
Yeah. Was Enoch Powell right in his Rivers of Blood speech, 1968? Was Enoch Powell right in his Rivers of Blood speech? I think it was 1968.
You all know the speech in reference to this is right. In 1968, Enoch Powell, who was a conservative politician, is generally agreed to have given a speech that made immigration sort of almost an undiscussable subject in Britain for decades. It was called the Rivers of Blood speech. It posited that Europe, that Britain specifically, well, he wasn't particularly talking about Europe, that Britain in particular was under massive risk from the immigration from the colonies that was going on. Several things about this. First of all, Powell was talking about race and was not talking about religion or ideology, and that's a very striking thing when you read back at that speech. And it's a striking thing because it's kept on shifting in Europe during the decades since. There was a moment in the 90s, for instance, and in the 2000s, when, having spoken about immigration in terms of race all these years, we suddenly started talking about it in terms of religion. It was suddenly about the Muslim community rather than the Moroccans and so on. There's a possibility that'll shift back, by the way. I already see some of that. I hear some of that across Europe, people talking about the race again rather than the religion. But that's one of the things. He was fixed on that particular issue. By the way, and there are all sorts of things Powell said which I don't agree with, and I think he was wrong on. But here's a very strange fact. Enoch Powell was slain by the British press, and his career was over. He was sacked from the Shadow Cabinet, despite, by the way, having the support for his speech of the majority of the British people. The majority of people polled, I think, was around 60 to 70%, said they agreed with Enoch Powell. Anyhow, one of the most striking things about it was that one of the biggest criticisms of Powell was a part of his speech where he talked about a woman who was the only white woman in a street somewhere in England where apparently everybody else was black. Now, at the time, this was one of the things that was picked over by journalists who said there is no such street, there is no such place. Now, I put this to you. In 2011, we had another census in the UK. That census, among other things, showed that people who ticked the box saying white British were now a minority in London. In 23 out of 33 London boroughs, people who ticked white British were a minority. Now, if Enoch Powell in 1968 had been writing his speech and decided, I'm going to use this speech to say that in 2011, white British people will be a minority in London, everybody would have said to him, what are you thinking about? You're a crazy man. You may have the eyes and ears of a prophet, but you're a crazy man. You've gone over. You've gone insane. Every single thing that even the doom mongers said has turned out to be wildly understated. It's the same in France. It's the same in every country. All the people, if you look back at all of the post-war decades, all of the people who your society and mine shut down as the prophets of doom turned out to have vastly understated the case. That is a very big problem.
No. Sorry.
One more?
Yeah. Yes.
About the Brexit process. God, I came here to get away from talking about Brexit. Where to start?
Well, you have
What's happening? I'll give you a really, really quick answer before we have maybe another happier. Maybe we take another happier question to end on, because I'm tired about Brexit, because we've been having a very long thing about this. I think, by the way, that the Brexit thing, I was a supporter of Brexit, albeit with many caveats. I do not think that our future in Britain was best served by the EU or the European Commission, and even if the rest of the continent wants to have further and further political integration, I just don't think it's something we wanted in Britain. We never really did. So it's best to get out. It's best, as Dan Hannan, the MEP, said in his farewell speech in the European Parliament the other month, to say, the EU has lost a bad tenant and has gained a good friend. But we were and always were going to be a very bad tenant. We didn't want the same things. We didn't want what the EU and the EC wanted, and we could see the direction of travel, and we decided to get off. I'm in favour of that, but I think there's all sorts of questions ahead, and we will undoubtedly be having a rough ride from the Commission, who will want us to fail. But I don't think we will fail, by the way. I think it'll be fine. And not very much will change on an ordinary, everyday basis. One other very quickly, because I hate Brexit. Sorry, I'm so...
But we have to... No, you ask questions. One question from you, and then we have to finish. Because there's going to be comedy club here at
exactly.
6 o'clock.
That's what I want to say. Like we are talking in the comedy club, and the whole discussion is in fact highly depressing, and makes us depressive. But where do you see the hope? Where do you see the seeds of hope?
The dead cats being thrown on the highway.
Sanctuaries. It's a very good question. Look, I mean, to be quite frank, no one's ever mistaken me for Prozac. I don't think there's much hope. I really don't. I don't think there's much hope. We've screwed this up royally, in my view. And there's no point in sugarcoating that or giving people false optimism and so on. I think there are tiny points of light, of which, may I say, you're one, of which a small number of others I would include, who are people who have thought their own way out of this, from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of directions. We had one with us this week from Canada, Rahil Raza. I can think of Majid Nawaz in my country, and others who, in the ones, but significant ones, are breaking the taboos, are breaking the paradigms, are breaking the expectations of the elite. I think, by the way, that my own view on this is that those of us who deal in ideas and books and articles and speeches and so on overestimate in the short term the power of ideas. We like to think that in a discussion, you think this, I think that, I will explain this to you, and you'll go, No. Now, all of you who are married know that disagreements don't often end that way. and often end very differently. I think the best you can do is to make sure the thinking is right when the events change. And we are seeing events at a very rapid pace in Europe now. And as the events keep happening, for ill, I'm afraid, the best we can hope for is that as they happen, the ideas will be in place to give people a better landing. My own view is that because of what Merkel and what others have done, we've got very little hope of a soft landing in Europe. But we, collectively, people in this room, people like you, the speakers here today, can help make that landing a bit softer and can ensure that when terrible things continue to happen, they do not take us all down. And in the meantime, tell Chancellor Merkel and the rest of them that they may well be suicidal, but they can't commit suicide for the rest of us. It's not a third-party process. Thank you.
Very well put.
Thank you.
Give me the microphone. Aya, me and Aya just want to thank you. And Aya's going to say some concluding remarks.
Well, yes, thank you. The conference has now come to an end, and we would like to thank all the speakers for their very interesting and thought-provoking contributions to this conference. And also thanks to the audience. It was very nice of you to come. And especially thank you to Jens Jonason, who has made this conference possible.
Thank you.
So thank you.
And as I mentioned, this has been not possible without the support of Middle East Forum. So thanks a lot, Middle East Forum and Danish Free Press Society. Thank you for all. Thank you.